Awesome. Okay, let's get this started then. So, hi everyone. My name is Yvette and I'm one of the senior account managers here at Relative Insight. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about how we used text analysis to deconstruct consumer tribalism, specifically through the lens of vaping. And then after my presentation, I'm going to hand over to Mark Lemon, who's an associate director over at Sign Salad, and he's going to give you a really interesting presentation all about semiotics. And then lastly, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions from the floor. So if you do have any questions for myself or Mark as we're chatting through our presentations, there should be along the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. So if you think of anything as we're talking, then just pop it into that Q&A section, and then we'll try and get through as many of them as we have time for. Awesome. But before we get started and start talking about vaping, I'm going to give you a quick explanation of who Relative Insight are for those of you who don't know. So essentially, we're a text analytics platform, which means that we help you analyze and visualize your text data. Originally, we were developed to protect children online. And what we did is we took online conversation and compared them. And through identifying differences, we were able to tell when someone wasn't a 14-year-old girl, but was actually a 40-year-old man. But nowadays, we help brands and agencies use that same comparative approach to get more value from 4 key types of text data, which is surveys, social listening, online reviews, and CS transcripts. But today, what we're going to be talking about is surveys. So historically, people don't like survey open ends very much. They're viewed as this kind of mess of unstructured text data that's quite difficult to get value out of. But at Relative Insight, we love survey open ends because our tool allows you to really easily and quickly get value out of that data. So why did we do a survey on vaping? Well, it's a common habit that unites people across things like gender, age, and class. It's also a controversial and growing sector, especially with the rise of things like elf bars in the last few years. But the survey wasn't just about vaping. What we wanted to show was how asking people about, a simple choice could reveal so much about consumer behavior. And that allowed us to give brands and agencies a lens through which to learn more about different tribes of consumers. So, like I said, we ran a survey and we split the data out based on various different responses. So the device that they used to vape, their brand of choice, how often they vaped, and then also demographic questions like age and gender. But crucially, we also asked a lot of open-ended questions around people's lifestyle choices and their motivations. And by analysing both open and closed questions and looking at differences, we were able to find common threads that enabled us to identify and develop these really distinct consumer tribes and unlock a new kind of demographic profiling. So in terms of methodology, what we did was, we asked some questions about vaping. So we asked people, the brands that they used, how often they vaped, why they vaped, what they liked about it. But we also asked a lot of questions that weren't about vaping at all. So things about people's hobbies and interests, how they would spend their dream weekend, how they would define themselves, and what matters most to them as well. And by analysing these open and closed responses, we were able to identify themes and repeated linguistic patterns, which became indicators to really help us shape and define these different tribal groups, which were health healers, tinker tailors, conscious curators, mercurial magpies, and flavor finders. And what's great is that these groups transcend traditional profiling. A magpie could be any age or gender, use any brand, but share personal values and have, purchasing habits and outlooks in common with each other. But let's delve a little bit more into what these tribes are. So first up, we have our health healers. These people are really big multitaskers. So they're always on the go, doing lots of different things at once, engaging in lots of different hobbies. And a lot of the hobbies they engage in are things like running, walking, swimming, and cycling. So yeah, we can say that it's a pretty active bunch. But in contrast to this, they're also quite hedonistic. So they're often using these active pursuits to balance out some of their more hedonistic personality traits, like vaping, for instance. And perhaps because they're seeking this balance, they really do view vaping as an alternative to smoking. So perhaps they, gave up smoking and then took up vaping instead. And what I found really interesting is that we saw quite a lot of people talking about how they would vape whilst exercising. So vaping at the same time as running, which is definitely really interesting to me. And although there isn't one specific device that is, only used by this group, what we saw as the most commonly used device were cigalikes, which are, replicate the experience of smoking an actual cigarette. So again, perhaps these people are looking for that experience without some of the harm associated with it. Moving on to our Tinker Tailors. So these people are just as busy as the health healers, but they're also really big planners. So they really like to plan their time so they can cram in as many different activities as possible into their day. And they might experiment a little bit with different brands or different products, but once they find a brand that they really like that fits their purpose, they will be loyal to that brand till the end. As I've said, they're really big hobbyists, so they're engaging in lots of different pursuits, but unlike the health healers, these tend to be more technical. So they like doing things like working on their cars or gardening. They might even, play around with computers a little bit. And that's because they really like to customize things. So yeah, of course, they're going to be customizing their car potentially, but this also extends to their vape as well. And they really love the engineering of vape. So these are the people who are going to be taking their vape apart, replacing parts to kind of customize that experience to what they really want. And because of this, their vape of choice are mods. Next up, we have our conscious curators. So as the name would suggest, these people are really image focused. They really care how they present themselves outwardly. And they're going to purchase things that match their aesthetics, yes, but also their values as well. And this is because they're actually quite a socially conscious and socially aware group as well. They're also pretty fashion and brand conscious, but they're less likely to be seen, wearing your big logos and your name brands. They're more interested in those brands that are trendy, but more on the cutting edge of fashion. And that's because they really walk this line between liking mainstream things, but also not wanting to appear outwardly like they are too mainstream. So they're really trying to find that balance between the two. And when it comes to vaping, they're much more discreet than some of the other groups that we see. So they might not actually vape whilst they're alone, only in certain situations, social situations where they're going to be seen by the right people at the right moment. And perhaps because of this desire for discretion, the most common used device we see for this group are vape pens, which can kind of easily be hidden in your pocket. Moving on to our mercurial magpies, which is probably the group that I would belong in if we're categorizing myself. These people, like the magpie, love everything shiny and new. They're the people who are, scrolling through TikTok, looking for the latest trends. And as soon as they've done one thing, they're going to hop on to the next one. Packaging is a really big thing for them. So they love the way that, a brand or a product presents itself, the way it's displayed. And convenience is also a big driving factor. And this is because they're a little bit more spontaneous when it comes to their purchasing habits. They're more likely to be making frequent purchases, but completely dependent on their mood in the moment or on that day. And when it comes to vaping, they probably don't really identify as a vapor. They might not be daily or even weekly vapors, but instead only vape, when the mood strikes them. So they might be out with all their mates who are having a vape, and then they'll go out and decide to buy one. And because of this kind of spontaneity and the convenience factor, the vape of choice for this group are definitely disposables. And lastly, we have our flavor finders. So these people are self-identified foodies. They love going out to eat, and they view dining out as a social activity. They love new experiences, which obviously extends to food, but also other things as well. So products, experiences. And they're a little bit more extravagant when it comes to spending. So they really don't mind dropping extra cash as long as it gives them that new experience that they're looking for, which might be things like holidays, cruises, or adventures. And a lot of these choices are being made because they really just want other people to think that they're really interesting and exciting people. And what's interesting is that they don't have one particular vaping device that is, unique to this group or most used by this group. They're really all about anything fun and trying new things. So any brand or device that offers a lot of different flavor options and the ability to chop and change and try is going to be appealing to this group. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through how we actually developed and defined these different consumer tribes. So we split the data up in a number of ways in order to do this. The first of which being by vaping device. So we've got 4 different devices here. And first up, we have our cigalikes. So this is the group that are engaging in active pursuits. And where you see this number, that 5.2 times, essentially what that means is that people who vape cigalikes are 5.2 times more likely to talk about engaging in active pursuits when compared to people who use other devices. So what that really allows you to do by using this metric is to apply a quant metric to your qual data, to your text analysis. They're also infinitely more likely to talk about vaping as part of their daily routine. And what that means is that they were the only group to mention this. So this idea of routine didn't come up in people who smoke other devices. They were also infinitely more likely to talk about multitasking. So this is where that person talking about vaping and running and vaping and swimming at the same time comes in. So I'm not 100% sure how the science of like vaping and swimming whilst underwater works, but definitely an interesting point. Moving on to mods. So people who smoke mods really like the reliability of these products. And they're also over 5 times more likely to talk about wanting to be in control. So you can see this person here talking about controlling the airflow into their device. And they really love the gadgety nature of mods. And you see this idea of customization coming through almost 40 or over 42 times more with people who smoke mods when compared to other devices. So again, this is not just switching out things like the liquid or the flavor, but actually tinkering around with the device. This person here is like swapping out a battery to get more save on power in their device, or swapping out the coil and so on. People who use vape pens or pods are over 2 times more likely to talk about using them to relax and unwind at the end of a potentially long and stressful day. And they're also infinitely more likely to talk about this idea of a sleek design. So they were the only group to mention this, and that's also because they care quite a lot about how easy it is to store and carry their device. So they really like the fact that the sleek design can really neatly fit into their pocket. And they were also 3 times more likely to talk about this idea of vaping as a social activity or a social prop. So they might not be the people who are vaping alone, but when their mates all go out to the smoking area, they can go out with them and feel included. So again, perhaps this is a way of like giving up cigarettes without having to give up the social aspect of smoking with their mates at the pub. And lastly, disposables. So we see almost 5 times more conversation about physical and mental health benefits of vaping, again, in comparison to smoking real cigarettes. And I guess unsurprisingly with disposables, the idea of color and flavor are coming through quite strongly. So things like elf bars, there is just a whole rainbow of different flavors and varieties to choose from. And this is a big selling factor for people who use this kind of device. Pricing is also a big factor, so that comes through 10 times more. They're really affordable when compared to some of the alternatives. And then interestingly, we saw this word trendy coming up in conversation about disposables. So we thought that was a really strange word of choice for people to describe themselves as. But yeah, people say that they feel trendy whilst smoking a disposable. We then teased it out even further. So we split it out by the brand of vape that people said that they use. Obviously, there's loads and loads of different varieties of vape brand out there. So this is by no means exhaustive, but these are just some of the ones that were coming up most often in the survey that we ran. So people who smoke Vuse are more likely to talk about the smell and taste of the product. And this idea of durability comes up over 35 times more. So they're really viewed as a very durable brand. People don't have to replace parts or even charge the device as often as they would with some of the alternatives. This brand Smok, the idea of reliability came up 7 times more, and trustworthiness came up infinitely more. So people who use this brand are going to stick with it for the long run because it's really seen as a reliable and trustworthy experience. They know what they're going to get when they use it. When it comes to Juul, people talk a lot about this idea of smoking them being fun. And we also only saw this kind of idea of it giving them a buzz coming up in this brand. So for them, it's all about the kind of emotional and physical experience of vaping. And when it comes to elf bars, people are talking about the different colors available and the different varieties of flavors as well. So again, this idea of there being a whole rainbow of different flavors to choose from. And what's interesting here is that we see the idea of like smell and taste coming up through Vuse, so the actual taste of the vape in the moment, whereas the idea of flavor comes up for elf bars. So like flavor choice, a bit of a distinction there. And Aspire, lastly, this idea of like the liquids that you can buy for Aspire comes up over 7 times more. So not only different flavor varieties, but also different nicotine content available. And really interestingly, we saw 56.5 times more mentions of kind of the short and medium term health risks associated with vaping when people were talking about Aspire. But this idea of short and medium term is really interesting because it suggests that they know that, you know, vaping still isn't excellent for them in the long run, but it's better for them in the short term than smoking real cigarettes. We also broke the data down using some demographic information that we gathered. The first of which was age, so we split it out by generation. So if we look at boomers, we really see that they view vaping, you know, in association to regular cigarettes, traditional cigarettes. So it's either viewed as an accompaniment or a replacement or an alternative to cigarettes. And this is really seen by the fact that they really, you know, distinguish themselves by saying that they vape rather than smoking. So they're going to say, I vape an elf bar rather than I smoke an elf bar. So they're really kind of distancing themselves from those cigarettes. And although disposable vapes might be more strongly associated with younger generations, we actually see boomers use the word disposable to describe vapes 2.7 times more. And interestingly, they really don't kind of align themselves as vapors. It's not a lifestyle for them or a hobby. It's just something that they do to fulfill a need, perhaps, you know, replace their craving for cigarettes. But it's not something that they're kind of really aligning themselves with strongly. For Gen X, they mentioned reducing risk and harm infinitely more than other groups. Again, comparing this to real cigarettes. And for them, ease of use is a big selling point. So they don't want things to be complicated. They like brands and devices that are easy to fill, easy to refill, easy to charge, and so on. When it comes to millennials, it's all about convenience. These words wherever and whenever were coming up infinitely more in their data. So really, yeah, all about convenience. And also this idea of a current favorite was infinitely more likely to come up. So that suggests that they've tried lots of other brands in the past and they might try other brands in the future, but their current favorite is elf bars, for instance. So suggesting that they don't necessarily have brand loyalty as much as some of the other generations might, and they're more likely to kind of try out different varieties. And when it comes to Gen Z, there was a real strong brand focus. So we see Lost Mary get mentioned almost 11 times more, and elf bars get mentioned 3 times more. And we think the reason that these brand names are coming through more for Gen Z is because they really don't want to refer to these devices as disposables. And I think the reluctance here is that Gen Z will view themselves as as an environmentally conscious, eco-friendly generation. So calling a device a disposable would mean they're admitting that they're smoking something and then throwing it away, whereas referring to it by the brand name allows them to kind of sidestep that a little bit. And lastly, we also split the data out by gender. So we asked a whole variety of people to respond to the survey, but people only self-identified as either men or women. So that's why there's only those two appearing on this slide. When it comes to women, they were the only group to mention that they didn't want to smell like cigarettes. So definitely prefer smelling, like strawberries or raspberries or whatever when compared to cigarette smoke. And they were also almost 10 times more likely to talk about packaging, color, and aesthetics. So that's everything from the box that the device comes in to the charger to the device itself. So that was all really important and appealing to women. Men, on the other hand, are only really smoking to seem cool. So I really like that second quote there. I look like a free man and I think I look very cool. I just think that's kind of sweet. So obviously, these are just a few of the findings that we uncovered through this analysis. If you'd like to learn more about how we developed these different consumer tribes, then you can use the QR code on the screen to download the full report. We'll also be kind of sending it around after the session, I'm sure, as well. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk to you about semiotics.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Yvette, for the really great talk there. What I'm going to do today is a very quick introduction to semiotics and to cultural language analysis, because I think it's a really great way of potentially adding an additional lens, an additional layer onto some of the great data that relative insight can help us to surface. So in terms of what I'll go through today, there will be a very quick punchy introduction to semiotics. Don't worry if you've not heard the word before. I will be making it accessible and hopefully a little bit interactive for you. We'll then look at the importance of meaning and how meaning is connected to identity in culture, with some examples as well to make that as clear as possible, before finally then also performing a very, very top-line analysis of some examples from the vaping category, which handily links back really nicely to the analysis that Yvette took us through. So should round us out for today. Okay, so from the perspective of a semiotician or of a cultural analyst, brands and consumers are inseparable from the culture that surrounds them. So what I mean by this is that as semioticians, we break down, we interrogate those links, those connotations, those threads of meaning that exist between brands, between their key competitors, between their category, and between culture at large. So to give you an example, if we think of a brand like Coca-Cola, for example, when we look at their packaging, we don't just see Coca-Cola, we look at it through the lens of developments in culture around the discussion of sugary drinks, for example. We look at them through the lens of their category and through the craft soda movement that's maybe affecting how we perceive their quality credentials. And we might also look at them in light of things like the recent Pepsi rebrand that they've done, changing elements of their logo. All of this is going to affect how we perceive Coca-Cola as a brand at the heart of it. So all of us, as we go about the world, are all the time receiving different signals, different information from culture that guides us in our understanding. So to give you an example of that, you can see on the chart here a house, and I wonder if any of you would mind perhaps dropping into the chat what you think might be happening in this house. Okay, excellent. Yes, I've got examples coming through. Yeah, a party, a children's party. Yeah, birthdays. Excellent. Well done. So what you've just done, you can give yourselves a pat on the back. What you've just done is a semiotic analysis. You've broken down the meaning of, in this case, the visual sign of the balloons on the door. And you'll probably, when you think of the party in there, evoking a whole range of sights, sounds, smells, sensations. Perhaps there's a type of music playing, there's kids running around, there's jelly and ice cream being served. This one signifier of the balloons on the door is taking you to this very rich cultural space filled with meaning, filled with cultural connotation. But what happens perhaps if we change the nature of the balloons on the door and instead make them perhaps silver and gold? You might still be thinking of a party, but perhaps now it becomes a slightly more adult party, and there's kind of cocktails and canapes and some light jazz playing in the background. The point being is that small changes to language, to visual information, can connect us to vastly different spaces of cultural meaning. And what a semiotic analysis does is it interrogates this what you might think is incidental data and actually reveals that is fundamental to our understanding, to how we navigate and find our place in the world. Okay, let's give you an example then. So the power of semiotics is that it can interrogate not just what is said, not just what is being communicated in a visual sense, but also how it is being said or communicated. So if we look at a language example, many ideas can be communicated in a number of similar but fundamentally different ways in culture. An example of this can be seen on the chart in front of you, where notions of an argument can, for example, be communicated using a metaphor of an argument as a war. So we might talk about an argument as something in which people take up positions, or they become entrenched in their ideas. One person might attack someone else's position, and that person might, in response, might dig in and defend their argument. They might approach it with a certain strategy or tactic, or they might undergo a kind of a campaign of communicating their argument, their idea out into the world. Perhaps two people, when communicating together, one person might chime in to reinforce the views of someone else. Or if they fail to do that, at worst case scenario, their argument might be shot down, and it might be found that their claims are indefensible. So what we can see is there's a strong thread here of quite warlike, combative imagery threaded through culture that forms how we talk about and think about arguments. But this is not the only way of doing this. And actually, there's an alternative metaphor that exists within culture for an argument, and that is the metaphor of an argument as a building. Now, in this metaphor, we might talk about an argument having strong foundations. You might build your case brick by brick. You might make a strong case together. An argument might offer a window into someone's worldview, or bring many different ideas under one roof. Points made might support each other perfectly, like the kind of scaffolding around a building, or if they fail to do so, someone's theory might collapse or be proven to not bear weight. So this is a very different way of talking about, and as semioticians, we believe, thinking about the notion of an argument. And I don't know about you, but if you had to, in a worst case scenario, get in an argument either with someone who thinks about it as a combative war, or with someone who thinks about it as a building process, I know I'd far rather talk with someone who sees it as a building process. There's much more potential there for finding some kind of collaborative middle ground and building something together than there is in the argument as war metaphor, at which the only successful outcome is the destruction of your opposition. So these cultural metaphors and how these ideas are communicated are incredibly revealing about profoundly different worldviews. Now, culture itself is not a static object, and actually over time, the way in which we talk and think about certain values, certain ideas can shift and move. On the chart in front of you, you can see an example of some material relating to the space of wellness. And on the left-hand side, this is what we would call the dominant narrative of wellness, where we see the presence of a lot of very moral language. So a brand like Innocent Smoothies, for example, innocent straight away has that sense of moral virtue and purity about it. We see references to purity as well, or brands like Good Culture, again, reinforcing this sense of positive morality. We see color palettes here that use very light colors or a lot of white that you might be used to seeing perhaps with representations of a wedding dress or a dove. Again, cultural symbols, signifiers of this sense of purity and virtue. And finally, some of the language that we might use in this space, you might talk about, for instance, going on a juice cleanse. There's very much a sense here that wellness is a cleaning practice. It's about removing anything kind of negative, anything sinful or dirty from the body in some way. But culturally, we can see that this is a narrative that is starting to shift. And actually, wellness is now becoming a space of rebellious action. We're seeing brands using darker color palettes. They're using much more ruder and cruder language, even reclaiming terms that historically have been very pejorative or would have been taboo. So brands like Slutty Vegan or Egg Slut, for example, to fast casual dining brands within a wellness space are reclaiming this very loaded and taboo language, and in doing so, asserting this sense of rebellious and a kind of game-changing approach to wellness. What we also see is illustration styles inspired by things like tattoo art that you can see with Rebel Kitchen, for example, and a greater sense of irreverence in the tone of voice. So this article that talks about dieting culture with this headline and this graphic that simply says, "Who cares?" So again, questioning that sense of kind of moral superiority and inherent virtue of the dominant space and indicating a very new narrative within culture. So, why is this important? All of these like ephemeral bits of information and these different ways of constructing ideas around argument or around wellness. Well, humans, you may have heard us referred to as the kind of the language ape. Now that's maybe a little bit of an oversimplification, but certainly it is true that as humans, we are inherently drawn to meaning, to its creation, to its communication, and to its sharing in culture. But when we do share it, we frequently do so in these indirect ways, employing various semiotic resources to communicate these ideas. So it could be our language choices, it could be our choice of party balloons, as we saw earlier, it could be our fashion choices, our habits, our hobbies, and also our purchasing behaviors, the types of brands that we choose to buy, that we choose to be seen buying and to share with our friends. All of these decisions communicate notions about our values, about our identity. So let's look at an example of how Relatives platform has helped us to decode further some of the key values of some consumer tribes. So this is an interesting group of consumer tribes, as this was conducted in the pharmaceutical space. So the consumers in this question were medical professionals in the US. And the client here knew that within this group, there were these kind of four different segments based on their different purchasing behaviors, how frequently they bought the product, whether they bought it seasonally or for a short period of time and then stopped, and the amount of their product that they were buying. So they had this idea that there were four groups, but they didn't understand the rationales, the values, the underlying meanings and key emotional drivers of these different groups. So we, using relative insights, input a large amount of data taken from some qualitative research interviews, which allowed us to surface some of the key language differences and identify the core meanings of these groups. So group one here we've called the strong fighters. One of the things that came out from this group was their use of battle metaphors. So not unlike the kind of argument is war metaphor that we saw earlier, but in this case, thinking about a treatment battle and talking about themselves being on the front line and needing new treatments as weapons in their armory. This metaphor was very important to group one. What they also did, they used far fewer personal pronouns. They talked about the people they engaged with as patients. They didn't talk about them being people or folks or any kind of casual language. It was always about patients, and it was keeping the patients kind of at a bit of an arm's length, at a distance. All of this suggested that they were a confident and very results-focused group. They see treatment as a battle and themselves as strong fighters, and they want treatments that are going to offer them a very kind of logical, clear output that they can kind of see before their eyes, that will give them these powerful weapons in their fight. Group two were the curious investigators. So instead of battle metaphors, they used journey metaphors. So in this case, they spoke about treatment steps and pathways and the opening up of doorways. So quite a different, profoundly different metaphor way of thinking about treatment itself. They also used far more active language and verbs, so references to searching, to striving, or to sniffing out problems for their patients. This reflected a group overall that were very optimistic, very methodical. They wanted to explore all of the different options on the table and leave no stone unturned in order to provide for their patients. Group three were the empathetic caregivers. Now, in this group, it was interesting to note that they used a lot of language in a way that placed themselves kind of in the shoes of their patients. They would speak from their viewpoint, saying patients prefer such and such, patients feel this. So actively placing themselves into the shoes of their patients. They were also much more emotionally invested. So they made references to being thankful or the feeling of having helped someone, and references to improving the quality of life of their patients. So they were very emotionally invested, very compassionate. They tended to think of people beyond simply being patients. They would look to their broader lives, their broader quality of life, and they wanted to provide holistic solutions that would improve that. The final group here then was the cautious controllers. So they made references to control, to management, and they appreciated much more structured and formal approaches to treatment. They also desired authenticity and tangibility. They wanted to see the results before their eyes. They spoke about the need for real results, not just something that was going to kind of manage symptoms, but that was actually going to have a lasting and real and tangible impact for their patients. This was a much more cautious group. They preferred a sense of rigor, of control, and they wanted to ensure that the overall treatment regime was delivered in this very orderly fashion. So why is this important, or what's useful about this? Well, this gave the client opportunities, therefore, to nuance their messaging, to communicate more clearly, more strongly, and align with the values of these different groups. And on the next chart, you can see a few examples. Now, we're not copywriters by any means, but this is just a way of addressing some of the key semiotic needs of these different groups in language. So you could take the same treatment and you could refer to it as the weapon you need in your treatment battle to appeal more to group one. Or you could refer to it as a tool that opens up patient options, and that would appeal more to group two. Or you could speak about being a helping hand to improve patient quality of life, which would particularly address the needs of group three. Or for group four, you might want to talk about reliability and offering the control to manage patient symptoms. Okay, let's have a very quick look now then at some very top line codes from the vaping category. And again, we can look at some of the key meanings, some of the key semiotic drivers of individuals in this space. I think this is definitely a category that, as was addressed earlier, a semiotic analysis can be particularly powerful because it's so related to the construction and creation of that identity. As mentioned, vaping is so much a part of many people's social behaviors. Perhaps whether they choose to be seen vaping or not is an important part of the discussion. So it's clearly, and the clear and sort of visual distinction between different types of vaping devices also offers opportunities for communicating very different values within a single category. So the first code that we identified, and this links very nicely, actually, I think, with the kind of the flavor finders categorization that Yvette identified earlier. This is the need within the category, or the expression of this need within the category, for a sense of instantaneous variety. So we see linguistic emphasis on immediate and novel sensations, so new flavors, never get bored of a flavor again, or products being bundled as a kind of mix or a mystery box, so a constant turnover of newness, of innovative new sensations. This is also reflected in the variety of bright colors and designs used by certain brands within the category. So there's an implication here that there's a rainbow of different flavor sensations, all of which code vaping as offering a diverse variety of instant and differentiated pleasurable experiences. So these messages all communicate well to groups that seek a sense of constant novelty and surprise, and see themselves as a kind of always on generation, always seeking that new thing. Alternatively, the second code that comes out from semiotically analyzing the category is a sense of mannered ritual. Now, this is a space in which we see vapors in more staged and kind of static poses resembling fashion portraiture. There's more ornate and eye-catching paraphernalia and devices, and some of the language here references to being cloud chasers or discerning vapors, codes vaping as a more decadent and exacting indulgence. This is a space here of consumers who desire a sense of control over their presentation as vapors. They see it as this attractive, mannered, and formalized ritual of control and connoisseurship. The next shift is the space, or the next code is this notion of approachable fun. So we see a lot of communications that talk about, they use very bright colors, they use very active sort of childlike poses, as you can see in this Juul communication. You see online guides to the kinds of shapes that you can make with vape smoke. And again, the use of bright colors and the use of confectionery style flavors, such as pink lemonade or blue raz ice, all codes vaping as a fun and frivolous entertainment, something for the approachable, the light-hearted in culture. And then the final code, which links really nicely to the space of Tinker Tailors, again, that was mentioned earlier, this is a space of tech sophistication. So language here is much more technical. You have vaporizer systems, tech-sounding acronyms, brand names that connote sci-fi language and morphology, and designs themselves that feature much more dark colors and metallic finishes, all connoting advanced sci-fi tech and coding a group of knowledgeable individuals who like to keep themselves up to date with the latest scientific and technological developments in culture. So again, there are opportunities to nuance the messaging for each of these groups, should you choose to. I won't go into all of these. It follows a similar principle to what you saw earlier. But I think the key thing I'd like you to take away from this is that when you're looking to speak to consumers, they don't just have functional needs, they also have semiotic needs. And if you're failing to decode their behavior, decode their language, and understand the underlying values, then you're failing to address this key cultural opportunity to communicate in a more resonant and impactful way that will address what they're looking to get from the category, from your brand. So addressing those semiotic needs and understanding them is incredibly important. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really, really interesting. We're going to move on to the Q&A now, but before we do that, I definitely have a couple of questions myself, if you don't mind answering some of those. So in terms of using relative insight, what benefit has that brought to your semiotics practice?
Yes, so we've been around as a semiotics agency for some 15 or so years, and we've been using relative for about the last 18 months. And it's really given us an opportunity to build on our approach and to understand differences that are going on at scale. So previously, some things, like there was the example earlier where one of the groups of healthcare practitioners were using statistically fewer personal pronouns. That's incredibly difficult for us with close reading to identify on its own, because personal pronouns are just so present in language in general that when we make our kind of analysis, when we're reading through these things, we're not there kind of counting every word. So relative has given us an opportunity to unearth a large number of insights, both more quickly than we would have done previously, but also some supporting data that we wouldn't have had. We may have felt intuitively the way this group is behaving, the way they're talking about themselves, they seem a bit more distant from their consumers, but now we have the data to back that up, to really reinforce that point, that can also really help with challenges around consumer segmentation as well, and really help give some very clear lines between different consumer groups.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really, really interesting. And then what are some of the typical comparisons that you've done with using us that you've found helpful?
Of course, yeah. So a lot of the time we are commissioned to look at changes in culture. So we do a lot of time-based comparisons. So looking perhaps at social media discussions from, from sort of 18 months ago versus now, to look at the way in which discussion is changing around certain cultural values. And that might be around things like refreshment or indulgence, all these kind of values, and the ways in which they're being talked about. It can be changing in quite profound and interesting ways that is really useful for brands to understand.
Yeah, so that's kind of tying back to the wellness example that you gave earlier, right? About how much that the language around that specific topic has changed over time. Yeah, I found that really, really interesting. And obviously we spoke, some of the examples you've given have been kind of like UK, and then obviously you gave the healthcare example, which is the US, but how does this approach work for other languages and cultures?
Yes, so we also do a lot of comparisons between different markets. At the moment, see primarily English-speaking markets often, but we're really excited by some of the new inclusions in the platform around the use of French, German, etc. And we have Spanish language speakers, French language speakers within our team as well. So we do work in these different languages, and it's really interesting to compare how different values can be expressed across markets as well, and to combine all of these, maybe doing a time-based comparison at the same time as doing a comparison of different conversations in different markets, which can give really powerful insights for brands in order to nuance their communications from one market to another, and understand maybe when they need to engage more with some of the emerging codes in some markets faster than others. It can be really useful. So yeah, we use a lot of different comparisons, but I think they really work well in combination and laddering up and supporting each other.
Yeah, definitely. I'm always surprised by how much things can vary within English speaking markets. The UK and the US can be so different on certain topics and issues. I mean, vaping as well is such an interesting one for that, because obviously some of the legalities around it are very different in, say, like Australia and New Zealand and America than they are here in the UK. So it's really interesting. Cool. So we've got a couple of questions coming through from the Q&A, so we'll delve into those. So the first question is, did you compare against all 4 devices? So the 5.2 times more likely is against the 3 other groups. Yes, in that example, yeah, we compared each device against all of the other devices. So yeah, that is the correct assumption. And then we've got a question for Mark. So it says, in these groups, using relative insight platform, how did you pull them as it is a comparative analysis? What did you originally compare it to? I'm not sure whether this person was meaning for the HCP stuff or the vape groups, but
okay, yes, yeah, I think it popped up during the HCP one. So this was a fortunate instance where the client knew in advance that they had these different kind of segments of consumers that they were looking to understand. They knew the groups existed, but they didn't understand their values. So actually the data that we had working with the partner agency with the interviews already told us that this is an individual in group 4, this is an individual in group 3, but it was then by comparing those groups that we could identify what the values of those groups were, those underlying values. So we were fortunate in that instance. But there are obviously a variety of different creative ways of addressing challenges like this. And we certainly have addressed and created different consumer tribes from raw data before without having that kind of metric put in place in advance. So again, just by digging around in the data, perhaps doing market comparisons or time-based comparisons to start to surface what some of those key differences might be.
And then the next question we have is, what tribe or group would each of the speakers put themselves in? And is there anyone they know who would fit into those tribes, who are archetypes for those tribes as well? I don't know if you want to go first, Mark.
Wow. So for the vaping groups, I mean, yeah. I don't sadly personally vape myself. I'd love to think of myself as a conscious curator, though, because I'm sure, you know, I think it's implicit in the analysis there as well, that these groups, they're not exclusive to their behaviors within vaping. They of course reflect their approach elsewhere. So I think, you know, I do a lot of kind of vinyl collecting and things like that, and I'd love to think of myself as that conscious curator, but it's probably more of a magpie-ish behavior. I'm sure if you ask my wife the chaos that I leave behind me, she'd probably put me in that group, but yeah, we'll see.
Nice. Yeah, as I said, I think I'm probably, I feel like I'm the same actually. I feel like I want to be a conscious curator, but probably more of a magpie in actual practice. But yeah, thinking about if I know anyone else, so my uncle who works in engineering and is a big like tinkerer. He loves like building Lego, and he loves like playing around with computers and like rebuilding, customizing things. He also smokes mods, like vapes mods. So that when that came up for the like Tinker Tailors, he was the first person I immediately thought of. That he definitely like really fits into that category. It was quite interesting to me. Cool. I think that is everything for today. So thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you, Mark, for coming and talking to me today. That was a really interesting presentation. But yeah, that's all we have time for. So if you're interested, like I said, in learning more, we'll be sending the report around afterwards, and you can kind of read more about the different consumer tribes that we created and how we kind of got to them. And if you're interested in learning more about how Relative could help you and your business, then definitely get in touch. But yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.